Hi, my name is Michael Briante. I am a third-year PhD student here at UCI. I am studying cultural anthropology, and today I'm going to be presenting on the globalization of science, cases in biotechnology, and drug development. Now, before I begin, I just wanted to clarify a few terms. First, what is anthropology? Anthropology is actually sort of a large field it's really hard to define because it's so complex, but basically, anthropology sort of focuses on the question of what it means to be human. And now, there are many different types of anthropology that are broken down into 4 subfields in the United States. The first could be said to be biological anthropology. Now, biological anthropologists study how the human body and physiology changes across space and time. There's also archaeology, and archaeologists study human material culture or tools from past societies. There's also linguistic anthropology, and linguistic anthropologists study how human language changes and varies across time and space. Finally, there's cultural anthropology. Now, cultural anthropologists study culture, which begs another question. What is culture? Culture is basically the systems of meaning and beliefs and practices that humans use to understand their world and really create their social environment. Now, cultural anthropology is my sort of subfield. We are sort of a particular case. We think we're special. We are convinced that we can study anything and anyone because, at least to some extent, we believe that everything is the product of human culture. So I study scientists. I basically do the science of science, if you will. I study how extremely smart people do extremely complicated things, and how their findings and the knowledge they produce is really the product of social interactions. So the next term is globalization. What is globalization? Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to define it as the interaction and the integration among various groups of people and organizations across the world. Now, this is increasing, and it's happening between both governmental organizations and non-governmental organizations. So what does globalization have to do with science, and what does it mean for anthropology? Well, this is one of the things I hope to show throughout this presentation. So, The Big Bang Theory. Does anyone watch this show? The show is basically about, as I'm sure many of you know, a bunch of socially awkward scientists who go about their lives working at a university, and they basically meet a less socially awkward girl, and they go on all sorts of adventures together. So, despite the fact that I really should have been working on my own research instead of procrastinating and watching this show, it actually inspired a large part of this presentation. So while I was watching the show, I noticed the scientists weren't just isolated in their own laboratories, producing knowledge, not communicating with one another, but they were actually working with other scientists, not only at their university, but across the world. So I'll give you an example of one of the things I noticed in the show. So there's the engineer, I believe his name is Howard, and there's one episode where he goes to Russia and actually goes on the Russian space station to help Russian scientists build a toilet. So this kind of funny example is sort of what I mean by the globalization of science. So a more formal definition would be that advances in scientific knowledge do not only occur in North America or Europe, but these discoveries and these advances are actually happening in developing countries all over the world. Very important discoveries. Places like Brazil, India, China, South Korea, etc. But the important thing to note is that these scientists aren't just making discoveries in their own. Say a Brazilian scientist isn't just working in his own lab, but it's happening through international collaboration. So these scientists are working together across nation states, across borders. They're doing things like co-publishing papers, sending the results in their laboratory to another laboratory, or basically just working together. And so scientific journals, for example, are often published in more than one language. And this is sort of evidence of the globalization of science, or how I'll be talking about it today. So the globalization of science, then, means that the production of scientific knowledge is occurring internationally and is not necessarily confined to the boundaries of any particular nation state. That'd be our working definition. So the second aspect of the globalization of science that I'll be talking about today is that it is not only occurring in universities, but also in corporations. Corporations that are setting up research laboratories and corporate offices all over the world. So science doesn't just happen in the university anymore. It's actually very much a corporate practice. So this has been happening in many different scientific fields, from physics to engineering. But today I'm really going to be talking about life science. Now, life science is the study of living organisms, or biology. I'm sure many of you are taking classes on this subject. And I'm going to be talking about life science, especially as it relates to human health. So there are two types of corporations that I want to talk about in more detail that work with life science or do life science research. The first are called biotechnology companies, and the second are called pharmaceutical companies. So before I define what biotechnology companies actually are, I just wanted to ask, what is biotechnology? Does anyone have any idea? So I think the best way to define this term is by breaking it down. So bios, the bio part, means life, and these are all Greek terms. Technos means tool, and logos means the study of, the ology part in biotechnology. So therefore, biotechnology means the study of living tools. Therefore, biotechnology involves using biological substances like cells, organisms, or genetic information to make products or tools that are useful to human society. So what are some examples of biotechnology, just to make this more clear? Some examples just off the top of my head would be genetically modified crops, stem cells, which I will talk about in more detail later, certain types of drugs like antibiotics, really any sort of technology that involves living matter. So biotechnology companies, or biotech companies for short, then are corporations that use life science research to develop products like medication, research supplies, or information that can be bought and sold on the market. Now, the biotechnology industry actually began right here in San Francisco during the 1980s and the Silicon Valley. So this is often referred to as the biotech revolution. So why might an anthropologist be interested in this? Well, while humans have been making tools for a long time, this is really nothing new, we have never made tools or living tools on such a diverse and massive scale. And this has posed all sorts of new questions that anthropologists asked about what it means to be human, what it means to live and work in the world when we can use life as technology to help us, to help cure diseases, to help produce new products, to create an entire new market. So that's why biotechnology is really important to anthropologists. Okay. So the second type of company is the pharmaceutical company. And pharmaceutical companies typically do the same thing as biotechnology companies, but on a much larger and diversified scale because they have more capital or money. They have a lot more money. And for this reason, you might often hear of pharmaceutical companies being referred to as big pharma on the news or in other types of media. So pharmaceutical companies don't always use biotechnology, but they might focus on chemicals or developing prescription drugs, for example. Biotechnology companies will actually be bought out by larger pharmaceutical companies that have more money. When a biotechnology company creates a product or a drug that seems promising, pharmaceutical companies might actually decide to license or just buy the entire company to sort of bring this drug or product to the market. So one of the examples I have at the bottom is Genentech. Now, Genentech was actually one of the very first biotech companies. As they state on their logo in the previous slide, they are in the business of life. So when they first started out, they were the first company to reproduce a naturally occurring substance in the body called insulin at the commercial level. Now, insulin is a hormone that helps regulate how our bodies convert our food into energy. It's very important. We all need insulin to survive. So this was an especially significant discovery for people who have diabetes and who cannot make insulin on their own. So as you see in this slide, Genentech actually was bought out by Roche, which is a larger pharmaceutical company, because Genentech seems so promising. So that's sort of the relationship between pharmaceutical companies and biotechnology companies. Pharmaceutical companies are usually much larger and they focus on prescription drugs, while biotechnology companies are usually more experimental and sort of in a different phase of the market structure. So one more thing to note is the fact that you're seeing all these logos is really no coincidence. They really emphasize how science has become an international business. Science has become a corporate practice, and these are all name brands. So in this presentation, I hope to answer two key questions. The first is, what are some new areas of life science research performed at the global scale? And second is, how has science become globalized, and what are the consequences of this? So I'm going to focus on three different but interrelated areas of life science research to sort of illustrate the answers to these questions. So the first is drug development. The second is genomics. And the third is stem cell research, or stem cell technology. So drug development. Drug development basically refers to the scientific and business practices that go into approving and marketing safe and effective drugs to treat disease. Normally when we go to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription drug, we don't really think about all the people, money, and effort that really goes into creating them. I hope to make this more clear in the presentation. So one thing to note is that the pharmaceutical industry and drug development is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's very expensive to make a drug. Second is that it also takes a lot of time to make a drug. So pharmaceutical companies really put a lot of effort and take a lot of risks when they decide to take on a project like this. So how are drugs made? Now I break this down into two phases: drug discovery and drug development. Drug discovery is basically where most of the laboratory research gets done. During drug discovery, scientists will isolate specific molecules or ingredients for a drug of interest that determine whether or not they will have the desired effect in humans, that the drug will do what it's supposed to do. In the later stages of drug discovery, potential molecules or ingredients that make up the drug are usually tested on laboratory animals. Okay, so drug development, the second stage of this process after drug discovery, really begins with clinical trials. Now, what are clinical trials? Clinical trials basically involve testing the effect that the drug has on humans. This requires finding a select group of people who may benefit by taking the drug. After being enrolled in the trial, these people are carefully monitored by doctors and scientists. And if the drug is proven to be effective in the majority of individuals, the pharmaceutical company will begin to market it and have it used by consumers. So to do this, the pharmaceutical company will apply for something called a patent, or a patent license for their drug. Now, a patent license is sort of like a deed to a house. It shows that you own it. So a patent allows pharmaceutical companies to own the recipe for their drugs, or their intellectual property is what it's also referred to. And this allows the pharmaceutical companies to sort of have a secure product. In other words, people can't copy it. They can use it for about 20 years and sort of get an edge on the market. So can anyone guess how much this entire process costs, all the way from drug discovery to drug development? The answer might actually surprise you, and the answer is actually increasing. Right now it costs anywhere from $300 to $800 million. So this process is extraordinarily expensive. And this price is increasing because drugs are getting more advanced and complex to treat specific diseases that could really never be treated before. So this takes a lot more time, laboratory equipment, and scientists to make them. So now I want to talk about how drug development has actually become globalized itself. This is the first example of the globalization of science, how drugs are made across the world and how this process has become increasingly global. So with the globalization of science, drug development is occurring on a global scale. And this is happening for several reasons. But I'm going to discuss one of the major factors. So remember that drugs cost around $300 to $800 million just to make. And this price is increasing due to advances in science. So in order to sort of decrease the costs, or not have as much risks, pharmaceutical companies will actually often outsource the clinical trials, remember, testing drugs in humans, to other locations. And they do this especially to places where there's a surplus of labor due to rampant unemployment. So the most popular places where this has occurred has been in countries like India, China, and Brazil, and even Russia. So in places like these, pharmaceutical companies are able to pay participants in clinical trials a lot less money than they would in the US or Europe. Obviously, this saves the pharmaceutical company money and simultaneously speeds up the time it takes to bring the drug to the market, because these countries do not have the same guidelines for conducting research on human subjects. So the process is a lot cheaper and it's a lot easier. This is why pharmaceutical companies outsource clinical trials. So subjects involved in such clinical trials are often referred to by anthropologists or bioethicists or other social scientists as clinical labor. And by clinical labor, I mean that the participants in the clinical trials, their bodies actually do a lot of the work for bringing the drug to the market. If the drug couldn't be tested on these people, we wouldn't know sort of the safety or the effectiveness of the drug. But this also brings up a lot of ethical issues. So just to familiarize you, ethics is basically the study of what is right and wrong in different contexts. So outsourcing clinical trials brings forth many ethical issues because sometimes the clinical labor or the research participants in developing countries are not given information about the drugs they're ingesting in a way that they can understand or that's completely clear. And because of unemployment, these clinical subjects may not have any other choice but to join the clinical trials as a source of income. So in some cases then, clinical labor is exploited labor. So these images describe one example. With the rapid decline of the textile industry in India, India used to be the world leader in textiles, the production of clothing, fabrics, garments, etc. And due to global competition, in particular in East Asia, which had way cheaper production costs and opened up a lot more textile factories, India's role as a leader in this industry started to decline. So in India, you have many cities or towns that just completely revolve around a textile factory. So when these factories shut down, essentially you have a lot of people left without jobs. So multinational pharmaceutical companies were actually aware of this, and they decided to set up clinical trials in these areas for cheap and available labor. They figured that because most of the town was unemployed, they would get a lot more clinical participants because it offers a way for such subjects to make an income without having many other choices. So in some ways then, these unemployed textile workers had no other choice but to join the clinical trials. So this brings forth this ethical issue. Are these workers being exploited? Do they really have a choice when it comes to determining their participation in the trial? Are they well informed? And this is one of the key consequences of the globalization of science, particularly as it manifests itself in drug development. So now I want to talk about the second area of life science that has been globalized, and this is genomics. Now, can anyone tell me what genetics is? Genetics is basically the study of the genes in our body. Now, genes are basically made up of DNA, and DNA has been described as, and this is a very, very basic definition, it's obviously much more complicated than this, but for the purpose of our slides, this definition will work. DNA is basically the blueprint for our body. So our DNA tells our cells when to divide and produce. It tells what the color of our hair should be. It can even tell what type of diseases we'll get, at least in part. So the genome consists of all the genes in DNA that provide the instructions for what our bodies should and should not do. So this is what is genomics. Genomics is the study of the genome. So in the 1990s, scientists at both universities and biotechnology companies began the Human Genome Project. So what is the Human Genome Project? This project essentially had the goal of mapping all of the approximately 20,000 to 25,000 genes in the human body. And the completion of this project, which actually happened in 2000, and then a more extensive map was completed in 2003, was really important for scientific research, medical practice, and drug development because it provided information about some of the most fundamental biological processes of the human body. So if we have a good map, the hypothesis was that if we have a good map of the genes and what our DNA does, we'll understand how the body works better and we'll be able to create drugs or therapies that sort of tailor to our genetic information. So as these pictures show, after the project began in the United States, genome sequencing centers that basically map out different parts of the genome have been built all over the world. As you can see in this picture, some well-known examples include the Beijing Genomics Institute in China, the Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology in India, and this is also happening in Korea. Really, there's genome sequencing centers all over the world, from Mexico City to Auckland, New Zealand. So this shows that genomics has become a truly global endeavor. And one of the reasons that it's spread across the world so fast is because a lot of companies were in the race to patent genes. And remember, patent genes basically establishes that a biological process, a drug, a therapy is the company's property. So a lot of companies were racing to patent genes. Now today, recently, it was established that genes cannot be patented, only complementary DNA can be patented. So genes that are modified. But there was still a race to sort of get this property, which sort of shows how science has become a corporate practice. So if genetics is the study of human genes, what is population genetics? So population genetics can be defined as the study of the genetic makeup of a particular group of people. And this is also one outcome of the biotech revolution, which is sometimes referred to as a revolution itself, the genomic revolution. So why do population genetics? Population genetics basically can help biotech and pharmaceutical companies gather and use genetic information about specific groups of people, and this helps them better develop drugs and target specific diseases. If you know more about the genetics of a particular group of people, you'll understand their biology better, and you can create drugs that are basically tailor-made to their needs. So, population genetics companies have set up laboratories all over the world, especially in areas that have been historically isolated. Now, can anyone guess why a population genetics company might be interested in gathering the information, the genetic information about a group of people or area in the world that's been historically isolated? The idea is that these supposedly genetically pure populations can give them an edge in creating new drugs, in drug development. So the problem is that most of these companies have gone out of business. This hypothesis really did not prove to be true. The genetic information didn't really help these companies develop new drugs. So the idea was that you go to a specific area in the world that's historically been isolated. There hasn't been a lot of interaction between people. Therefore, the people there have very similar genetic information and genetic propensities for certain illnesses. Now, this is what the pharmaceutical companies thought would help them with drug development, but this did not end up proving to be true. So, because areas of life science like genomics are relatively new, scientists have not mastered it, and sometimes the science doesn't work, in the case with population genetics. So when this risky science becomes a business, the businesses often don't work either, and they go out of business. So some famous examples include, of population genetics and companies include Decode Genetics, who gathered genetic information from the Icelandic population using medical records and blood tests. And Promising Genomics is actually a book all about how this happened, how Decode sort of set up shop there and gather genetic information from the people. Another famous example is Shar DNA, who gathered information from inhabitants of Sardinia. Sardinia is an island off the coast of Italy, and it actually has one of the largest populations of people who live over 100 years old. So that company thought there'd be a lot of useful genetic information in the study of aging and creating drugs that sort of help the aging population. So after SHAR-DNA went out of business, the large database of genetic information of the Sardian people was put up for auction. And this caused quite a bit of public debate and ethical issues I will talk about in a bit. So one more important term to bring up is biocapital. And as you can see on this slide, the book Biocapital was written by an anthropologist who was actually here at UCI for a while, who sort of elaborated on this term. So first, what is capital? Capital are essentially goods or money used to generate more income. What does bio mean? Bio means life. So when you combine the two together then, biocapital is life, organisms, or information about organisms that is used to generate income. So in the population genetics example, biotech companies are using DNA from particular groups of people to later develop drugs that will be bought and sold on the market. So Decode Genetics and SHAR-DNA were trying to use the genetic information about specific populations to eventually make genetic therapies or new drugs. So we're essentially dealing with a different but related ethical issue here in the globalization of science. Remember, ethics is the study of what's considered right and wrong when dealing with human research subjects in this case. And this is a different ethical issue from what happened with clinical labor, whether or not this labor is exploited. So the issue regards the ownership of, in this case, genetic information that tells all about a specific group of people's biology. Specifically what diseases they have or the likelihood that they will develop a certain disease. So certain questions come to mind. Who owns this information? Do the biotech companies own it? Do the individuals own it? Or does the government own it? Now there's really no right answer here. Many social scientists and bioethicists are still debating about this today. But the important thing to note is that this genetic information that these companies are gathering has very personal information. And these companies are trying to profit off of it. But are they profiting off of something that's not theirs? It's still to be debated. Now I'm going to go into the third area of life science research that has become globalized, and this is stem cell research. So first I just want to give a very cursory definition of what stem cells are. Stem cells are basically special cells that have the ability to turn into almost any other type of cell in the body. So there's different types of stem cells, of course. Some stem cells can turn into muscle cells, some can turn into fat cells, some can turn into bone cells, some can develop into whole organs. Therefore, stem cell science has the potential to create cures for countless numbers of diseases that currently have little or no treatment because they are able to replace lost or damaged tissues, organs, and cells in the human body. A lot of diseases are caused by dysfunctional biological processes, dysfunctional organs, dysfunctional cells. The idea with stem cell research is that one day we'll be able to replace those lost or dysfunctional cells, or we'll be able to regenerate them. So stem cell research was originally made popular in the US in 1998. And after that, there was a huge growth of biotech companies that make stem cell products and are developing stem cell therapies all over the world. Today, stem cell science is a truly global endeavor, just like genomics. The Nobel Prize in Medical Research, for example, was awarded to a Japanese scientist and a British scientist who came up with ways to make stem cells work better. So that shows that international collaboration component. So can anyone guess, based off of this map, where the fastest growing stem cell research is taking place? Now you might not be able to tell just by looking at this because obviously on this map, each little laboratory flag there denotes a major stem cell research center. There's a lot in the US, there's a lot in Europe, but the most robust research and fastest growing research is actually taking place in East Asian countries. Places like China, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, and other places in that area. So one more thing to note is that stem cells aren't found in nature. You can't simply extract stem cells from the human body without doing further laboratory work. Stem cells are made. So they're a biotechnology or a living tool created by scientists in different laboratory environments. Therefore, each laboratory has its own unique type of stem cells. So what I was trying to get at with the title of this slide was that while the cells are local, they're created in specific university laboratories or biotechnology companies, the science has become globalized through international collaboration. Okay, so now I want to talk about stem cell regulation and policies across the world that actually vary dramatically. So while stem cell science is indeed a global endeavor, governmental policies regarding research protocol and the availability of treatments vary dramatically across national climates. In the United States, for example, there is a high level of governmental regulation regarding the use of stem cells in scientific research. Today, there's actually only one stem cell treatment approved for consumer use in North America. One of the biggest obstacles for the U.S. stem cell industry, then, is receiving approval from the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is a governmental institution that regulates what type of drugs or medical treatment can be sold for human use. So in other words, approval must be granted from the FDA before biotech and pharmaceutical companies can bring a drug or treatment to the market. So there are very strict regulations in the United States. In India and China and Mexico, on the other hand, governmental policy regarding stem cell research is a lot more relaxed and less defined, although this is starting to change a lot more in China. In fact, there are a variety of treatment options, actual stem cell treatment options, available to citizens and non-citizens. So right now, you can go down to Mexico and get stem cell treatment, for example. However, many United States scientists and medical doctors warn about the safety of these treatments. So this brings me to the next slide, medical tourism. And this is very much related to stem cell therapy. So what is medical tourism? Basically, it means going to a foreign country to receive a medical treatment that is not available or legal in one's home country. Medical tourism. In fact, medical tourists often receive the entire tourist or vacation experience as part of their treatment package. The companies that offer such treatments will cater specifically to the medical tourism industry and set up hospitals on beautiful beach settings, offering spas, massages, and pools. So right now, as I mentioned before with Mexico, this is happening with stem cell therapy. Because several countries offer stem cell treatments while the United States does not, many individuals, or at least those who can afford it because it's very expensive, go to countries like China, India, and Mexico to receive such treatment. This phenomenon is also happening with a lot of other medical treatments that are not available in specific countries. So you're probably wondering why I decided to put a picture of Kobe Bryant in this slide. Kobe Bryant is actually an example of a famous medical tourist. He traveled to Germany to receive rich plasma therapy, which is a type of cell therapy for his knee. This therapy is unavailable in the US, and basically it extracts platelets from the blood to basically repair his muscles, tendons, or joints. So I think this example is interesting because it shows that medical tourists do not necessarily just go to developing countries or other countries that have less regulation. The availability of treatments varies across the world, and this is due to the framework for regulation. So Kobe Bryant went to Germany. Some people come to the US for medical tourist treatments. So I just wanted to conclude, and the main take-home point here is that one does not simply globalize science. It's a very complicated process. You have to deal with other nation states, other regulatory bodies, other cultures, essentially. Scientific practices in scientific knowledge production have been fundamentally shaped by globalization, and this has led to extraordinary advances, but it's also created new ethical problems that I've discussed throughout these slides. Drug development, as I said, has led to novel treatments that are now available to consumers because pharmaceutical companies make them. But it has also exploited specific groups of people, like I gave with the example of unemployed textile workers in India, who were sort of forced to join these clinical trials because there really weren't any other forms of income or labor available. Genomics has led to a vast knowledge of biology, but has also created new issues regarding biocapital and biological property. Remember in the Sardinia or Iceland example, who really owns that DNA and who deserves to profit off of it? Do the people who are offering it get to profit off of it, or do the biotech companies, or does the government? Finally, while stem cell science may be the future of medicine, replacing or repairing lost or damaged organs, tissues, and cells, regulation and safety must be carefully monitored in the global context. Many people have been in very serious conditions, poor health, because they've received stem cell therapy in countries where it's not regulated. So I just had a few concluding questions and remarks that I wanted to bring up just for further thought and to take home some of these points. How has globalization changed the way we do science? How have recent scientific advances changed the way we think about what it means to be human and live in the world? What are some of the benefits of science as a corporate practice? What are some of the problems? What other types of science are important in the global context? Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you learned a lot from this presentation.